The first warning was not the money. It was not the abandoned house, the locked bedroom, or the television tuned to nothing but static. The first real warning was a man at the door who looked directly into my eyes and whispered, "Watch out." Tonight, I have 3 stories about familiar faces, familiar voices, and the terrible moment when recognition becomes a trap. In the first, a young woman accepts a strange arrangement with a wealthy man she met online. The favors begin harmlessly enough, but one morning, she discovers that the man standing in front of her is not the man she has been speaking to. In the second, a nurse checks the camera in his son's bedroom and sees his wife and child staring back at him. The only problem is that his real wife and child are asleep in a different room. And in the third, a woman living alone begins hearing her own voice in the apartment beneath her, repeating conversations that have not happened yet. These are stories about the moment a face stops being proof of who someone is. And once that happens, what can you trust? This is Night Evidence. Story 1. The Man Who Wasn't Jack. When I met Jack, I was 23, exhausted, and almost completely broke. I was in my final year of college. My rent was late, my credit card was nearly maxed out, and I had started measuring every purchase by how many meals it would cost me. Jack's profile appeared on Tinder late one night. He claimed to be 45. His photographs showed a clean-cut man with silver beginning to appear at his temples. He wore tailored shirts, stood beside expensive cars, and smiled like someone who had never checked his bank balance before ordering dinner. His biography was unusually direct. He was looking for companionship. He valued privacy. He was generous with people who could follow instructions. Normally, I would have swiped past him. Instead, I looked at the overdue notice sitting beside my laptop and matched with him. He messaged almost immediately. There was no flirting, no request for photographs, no attempt to impress me. He asked whether I could be discreet. I asked what that meant. He said he occasionally needed small favors performed by someone he could trust. Delivering a package, waiting at a house, passing a message to an employee. In return, he would send me $700 each week. I assumed it was a scam. Then he transferred the first payment before asking me to do anything. The money appeared in my account the next morning. My first assignment came 2 days later. Jack sent me an address at the edge of town and told me to collect a small parcel from a man named Julio. I was not to open it. I was not to photograph it. I was to place it inside a locker at the bus station and text Jack the locker number. The address led to a narrow house with sheets covering the windows. Julio opened the door only a few inches. He was a heavy man with a tattoo running from his neck to his jaw. He handed me a package wrapped in brown paper. Before I could leave, he caught my wrist. Not hard enough to hurt me, just hard enough to make sure I listened. "You know Jack?" he asked. I told him yes. Julio studied my face, then glanced over my shoulder as if someone might be standing behind me. "Watch out," he said. I asked what he meant. He released my wrist and shut the door. I completed the delivery. Jack sent another payment and thanked me for being reliable. That should have been the end of it. But $700 a week can make almost any explanation sound reasonable. Over the next month, the errands continued. I left an envelope beneath a table in an empty restaurant. I collected a key from a storage facility and mailed it to an address in another state. I drove a sealed box to a house that appeared abandoned. A light was glowing in one upstairs window, but nobody answered the door. Jack told me to leave the box on the porch and walk away without looking back. I did look back. The box was already gone. There had been no sound of the door opening. Whenever I asked Jack what I was transporting, he gave the same answer. Nothing that can hurt you if you follow the rules. Then he invited me to his house. It was the first time we were supposed to meet in person. His home stood alone behind iron gates, nearly an hour outside the city. It was larger than any house I had ever entered, but it felt strangely unfinished. The rooms were spotless. There were no family photographs, no books left open, no coat hanging by the door. It looked less like someone lived there and more like someone had constructed a convincing model of a home. Jack was not there when I arrived. He texted that he had been delayed. He wanted me to spend the night and wait for a delivery scheduled sometime before sunrise. The payment would be $2,000. Then he sent me the rules. Keep every exterior door locked. Do not open the curtains after dark. If the doorbell rings, do not answer it. If anyone calls the house telephone, do not pick up unless the caller asks for Marvin. At midnight, turn on the television in the upstairs bedroom and leave it on the channel showing static. Do not sleep in that room. And no matter what I heard in the hallway, I was not to leave the guest room between 1 and 5 in the morning. I read the list twice. Then I laughed. I told myself rich people were eccentric. Perhaps this was some elaborate test. Perhaps Jack wanted to know whether I could obey instructions before trusting me with something more valuable. At 11:55, I went upstairs. The bedroom at the end of the hall contained nothing except an old television facing a bare mattress. I switched it on. Gray static filled the screen. The sound was low, like distant rain. At exactly midnight, the doorbell rang. I froze. It rang again. Then a man called through the front door. He said he was Jack. He said his phone was dead and asked me to let him in. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down at the entrance. The voice sounded calm, friendly, almost amused. When I did not answer, he began knocking. "I know you're in there," he said. "I can see the television." I backed away from the stairs. My phone vibrated. It was a message from Jack. "Do not answer the door." The knocking stopped. A few minutes later, the house telephone began ringing. I let it ring 6 times before the answering machine picked up. A woman's voice came through the speaker. She used my full name. Then she said she was my mother. My mother had been dead for 4 years. I unplugged the telephone from the wall. At 1 in the morning, I locked myself inside the guest room. For the next few hours, something moved through the hallway. Sometimes it walked slowly. Sometimes it stopped directly outside my door. Once, I heard fingernails drag from the top of the wood to the bottom. Then Jack's voice whispered from the other side. "You forgot one of the rules." I checked the list again. The television. In my panic, I had turned it on, but I had lowered the volume until it was almost silent. Maybe that was what he meant. I did not leave the room. At 5 in the morning, the sounds stopped. Sunlight appeared beneath the curtains. My phone showed a new message from Jack. "All clear. You can come out now." I waited another 20 minutes before unlocking the door. The hallway was empty. There were long scratches on the outside of the guest room door. Downstairs, I smelled coffee and frying butter. A man was standing in the kitchen with his back to me. He turned and smiled. I recognized him immediately from Tinder. Silver at the temples, blue shirt, the same warm, confident expression. "You did well," he said. "Breakfast." I should have felt relieved. Instead, every part of me wanted to run. There was something slightly wrong with his smile. It arrived a moment before the rest of his face seemed ready for it. I asked if he was Jack. He laughed. Who else would I be? My phone vibrated in my hand. The man's eyes moved toward it. I looked down. It was a message from Jack. I'm sorry. My flight was canceled. I'm still out of town. Do not speak to anyone inside the house. Leave now. The man across from me stopped smiling. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then he tilted his head. It was not a confused gesture. It looked as if he were listening to something very far away. I ran. He did not chase me. He only called my name as I crossed the foyer. His voice changed each time. First it was Jack, then Julio, then my mother. I reached my car, locked the doors, and drove until the house disappeared behind the trees. Jack kept messaging me. He told me not to go home. He told me to throw away the phone. He said I had broken the arrangement and that he could no longer protect me. I asked him what had been inside that house. He never answered. I drove to a crowded diner and stayed there until afternoon. Then a photograph arrived from an unknown number. It showed the front of my apartment building. The picture had been taken from across the street. Beneath it were 2 words: watch out. I changed my number. I moved out before the end of the week. I deleted every dating profile I had. I never received another payment from Jack. 6 months later, a woman contacted me through social media. She said she had found my name written on a piece of paper inside a parcel she had been paid to deliver. A wealthy man she met online had offered her $700 a week. His name was Jack. She wanted to know whether he was safe. I began typing a warning. Before I could send it, her account disappeared. Sometimes I still search for her name. Sometimes I search for Jack. I never find either of them. But last winter, a friend showed me a dating profile she thought was funny. The man claimed to be 45. He stood beside an expensive car. Silver showed at his temples. It was the same face. The name was different. And the final line of his biography read, I am generous with people who can follow instructions. Story 2. The Family on the Monitor. I work nights as a nurse. At 3 in the morning, every hospital begins to feel unreal. The lights are too bright, the corridors are too quiet, and the people you pass seem to be moving through a world that belongs only to them. During a slow shift last October, I checked the camera in my 3-year-old son's bedroom. It was something I did whenever I had a spare minute. My son had been having nightmares, and my wife often slept beside him until he settled down. The camera feed loaded. My wife was sitting on the edge of his bed. My son sat beside her. Neither of them was asleep. They were facing the camera. At first, I smiled. I assumed my wife had seen the small light switch on and was waiting for me to speak through the microphone. Then I noticed their eyes. The image was grainy, but their eyes looked pale, almost completely white. Neither of them blinked. I pressed the microphone button and said my wife's name. They did not react. I called her phone. She answered after the 3rd ring, sounding half asleep. I asked where she was. She said she was in our bedroom with our son. He had climbed into our bed after a nightmare. I looked back at the monitor. The 2 figures were still sitting in his room, still facing the camera. I told my wife to switch on the bedroom light and start a video call. She did. There she was, standing beside our bed. Our son was asleep beneath the blankets behind her. I turned my screen so she could see the camera feed. For a moment, she said nothing. Then the figure wearing her face smiled. My real wife screamed. I told her to take our son, leave the house, and not look into his bedroom. She grabbed her keys and carried him toward the stairs. I watched through the video call as she passed the hallway. From behind the closed door of our son's room, A child began to cry. It sounded exactly like him. "Mommy," it called. "Don't leave me." My wife kept walking. The doorknob began turning. She reached the front door and ran to the neighbor's house. I called the police from the hospital. By the time they arrived, the bedroom was empty. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no open windows. The officer who checked the room found the camera where it always was, mounted high on the wall. He waved at it. I saw him clearly through the app. But behind him, on the bed, my wife and son were sitting again. The officer turned when I shouted over the phone. The bed was empty. Only the camera could see them. We left the house that night. My wife and son stayed with her sister. I stayed with a co-worker named Daniel because I could not bear the thought of being alone. I disconnected the camera from our home network. The feed continued. For 6 days, the things that looked like my family sat on the bed. The room changed around them as the sun rose and set. Dust drifted through the light. Shadows crossed the walls. So I knew the feed was live, but the figures barely moved. Occasionally, my son's double leaned toward my wife's double and whispered into her ear. Occasionally, they both looked toward the bedroom door. They never slept. They never ate. They never left the bed. On the 4th night, Daniel watched with me. He asked how I knew the feed was really coming from my house. We drove there and stopped on the street. I threw a small stone at my son's window. The tap came through the camera's microphone a fraction of a second later. Both figures turned toward the window. Then the one wearing my wife's face stood. It walked toward the camera until its face filled the screen. The eyes were not white anymore. They were open holes, reflecting no light at all. It raised one finger to its lips. The feed went black. The next morning, I contacted the police again. I expected them to dismiss me. Instead, 2 officers agreed to meet us at the house. One remained outside with us while the other entered. We watched his body camera on a small screen. He searched the ground floor first. Nothing was disturbed. Then he climbed the stairs. As he approached my son's room, the bedroom camera came back online. My wife's double and my son's double were sitting on the bed. The officer opened the door. On his body camera, the room appeared empty. On the bedroom camera, the 2 figures turned to look at him. The officer took one step inside. The door slammed behind him. His body camera shook. We heard him shout. Then came a sound I still cannot describe without feeling sick. It was wet and mechanical at the same time, like an animal trying to breathe through broken machinery. The second officer ran into the house. Daniel and I followed before either of us had time to understand how foolish that was. By the time we reached the stairs, gunshots were shaking the walls. Something fell from the landing. It landed at my feet wearing my son's pajamas. But it was not shaped like a child anymore. Its arms were too long. Its joints bent in several directions. Yellow-green fluid spread across the floor beneath it. Its face was still my son's. It looked up at me and said, "Daddy, it hurts." I could not move. Daniel pulled me backward just as one of its arms unfolded and struck the wall where my head had been. The second creature appeared at the top of the stairs. It wore my wife like a memory. Her face kept changing, smiling, crying, going blank. Behind it, the first officer lay motionless in the hallway. The second officer fired until his weapon was empty. The creature fell, but it did not stay down. Its body opened along the center as if a hidden seam had been unfastened. Thin, black limbs reached from inside it and dragged it forward. We ran. Something struck me in the back before I reached the front door. I remember the floor rushing toward my face. I remember Daniel screaming. and I remember hearing my own voice from upstairs. It was calling to the police. It told them I was still inside. I woke in the hospital 2 days later. Officials I had never seen before were waiting beside my bed. They did not identify their agency. They asked what I had seen, what the creatures had said, and whether I had ever noticed strange behavior from my wife or son before that night. Then they told me the house had been destroyed by a gas explosion. The 2 officers had died in the blast. Daniel had survived, but he refused to speak about what happened. The officials took my phone, my computer, and every recording I had saved. They said the camera feed had been fabricated. I asked them who had fabricated it. They did not answer. My wife and son were placed under observation for 3 weeks. When they were finally allowed to come home, we moved to another city. We do not use cameras inside the house anymore. We have rules now. If one of us enters a dark room, we say a private phrase before the other person comes closer. If my son calls from somewhere we cannot see him, we find my wife first. If any of us appears somewhere impossible, we run. For almost a year, nothing happened. Then, last week, my old camera application sent me a motion alert. That should have been impossible. The camera had been destroyed with the house. I opened the notification. The image showed my son's old bedroom exactly as it had looked that night. 2 figures were sitting on the bed. My wife, my son. But this time, someone else was standing behind them. He wore hospital scrubs. There was a scar across his forehead in the same place I received mine when the creature attacked me. He looked exactly like me. And while the other 2 stared at the camera, he was staring at the bedroom door, waiting for someone to come in. Story 3. The woman downstairs had my voice. I moved into the Bellwether apartments because the rent was suspiciously cheap. That should have bothered me more than it did. The building stood at the end of a narrow street behind an old railway line. It had 6 floors, 1 unreliable elevator, and hallways that always smelled faintly of wet plaster. The landlord called it historic. The tenants called it tired. I called it the only place within walking distance of my new job that I could afford. My apartment was 7B on the top floor. Directly beneath me was 6B. According to the landlord, 6B was empty. The previous tenant had left in the middle of her lease, and a broken water pipe had damaged the bedroom ceiling. Repairs were supposed to begin soon. For the first week, I heard nothing from below. Then, on a Tuesday night, someone laughed beneath my living room floor. It was a woman's laugh. Quiet at first, then suddenly loud, as though she had moved directly beneath my chair. I paused the television and listened. The laugh came again. It sounded familiar, but I could not explain why. I told myself sound traveled strangely through old buildings. Maybe it came from 6A or from the street. The next morning, I mentioned it to the landlord. He looked confused. "Nobody is living in 6B, he said. I asked whether workers had been inside. He said repairs had been delayed. The apartment had been locked for nearly 2 months. That evening, when I returned from work, the elevator stopped on the 6th floor, even though I had pressed 7. The doors opened. The hallway was dark except for the red exit sign at the far end. Every apartment door was closed, but the door to 6B stood open by about an inch. From inside, I heard a woman speaking on the phone. "I just got home," she said. The elevator did that thing again. I felt an immediate chill. Those were the exact words I had said to my sister, less than a minute earlier. I was still holding my phone. My sister was still on the line. "What's wrong?" she asked. The voice inside 6B repeated her question. Same words, same concerned tone. But half a second later, I stepped back into the elevator and pressed the button for the 7th floor. As the doors began closing, the gap in the door of 6B widened. I did not see a person. I saw only darkness. Then my own voice called from inside the apartment. "Wait!" I spent that night with every light turned on. Whenever I walked across the living room, I imagined someone beneath me following the same path. At 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps below. One step for every step I had taken earlier, from the front door to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the bathroom, from the bathroom to the bedroom. Then the footsteps continued across a part of the floor where my apartment ended. They stopped directly beneath my bed. The next day, I convinced the landlord to open 6B. He brought the building superintendent and made a show of checking the lock before turning the key. The apartment smelled of dust and stagnant water. Plastic sheets covered the furniture. A dark stain spread across the bedroom ceiling. There were no clothes, no food, and no sign that anyone had been staying there. I walked into the living room and stood beneath the place where I had been sitting when I heard the laughter. The ceiling above me creaked. My landlord glanced upward. "Old building," he said. Then someone laughed in the bedroom. All 3 of us heard it. The superintendent went pale. He hurried into the bedroom, pulled aside the plastic sheets, and checked the closet. Nothing. The landlord insisted the noise had come through the pipes. But as we left, I noticed something written in the dust on the inside of the front door. It looked as though a finger had traced 3 words. "She hears you." I asked the landlord about the previous tenant. He claimed not to remember much. Her name was Mara. She was quiet. She worked from home. One morning, she returned her keys and said she would not be coming back. I found Mara through an old package label still stuck inside the mailbox for 6B. It took me 2 days to locate her online. When I sent her a message saying I lived in 7B, she blocked me. I contacted her from another account and mentioned the voice. She replied within a minute. "Do not speak while you are inside the building." Then she blocked that account too. I should have left immediately. Instead, I tried to prove there was a rational explanation. I placed my phone on the living room floor and recorded through the night. The next morning, most of the file contained nothing except distant traffic and the hum of my refrigerator. At 3:14, my sleeping voice said, "Who is it?" 5 seconds later, another voice answered from beneath the floor. "It's you." Then the recording captured me getting out of bed. That never happened. I had slept through the night. On the audio, my footsteps crossed the room and approached the front door. The lock turned. The door opened. A woman entered and stood close to the phone. She breathed into the microphone for almost a minute. Then she whispered in my voice, "Not yet." I listened to that section over and over. There was no sound of her leaving. That evening, I packed a bag and called my sister. I told her I needed somewhere to stay. Before she could answer, the woman beneath my floor began repeating everything I said. But this time, she was no longer half a second behind. She spoke at exactly the same moment I did. The words came through the floor in perfect unison with my mouth. I stopped speaking. She continued. Using my voice, she finished the sentence I had been about to say. "I think someone is inside the apartment downstairs." My sister heard it through the phone. She asked who was with me. The woman below answered, "Nobody." I grabbed my bag and ran into the hallway. The elevator was already waiting. Its doors were open. The display above them showed the number 6. I took the stairs. As I passed the 6th floor landing, Every light in the hallway switched off. The door to 6B opened. Someone stood just inside. I could see the outline of a woman about my height. She was wearing the same coat I was wearing. Her face remained hidden in the darkness. "You forgot something," she said in my voice. I kept moving. She stepped into the hall behind me. I heard her shoes strike each stair exactly when mine did. She matched every breath, every stumble, every terrified sound I tried not to make. When I reached the lobby, the front doors would not open. I pulled the handle until my hands hurt. Behind me, the stairwell door slowly swung outward. The landlord's office was beside the mailboxes. I ran inside, locked the door, and called the police. The woman stopped outside. Through the frosted glass, I saw her silhouette. She lifted a phone to her ear. My sister's name appeared on my screen. I answered without thinking. At first, all I heard was crying. Then my sister said, "Why are you outside my house?" I could not understand her. She said a woman was standing across the street, watching her front door. The woman looked exactly like me. Someone knocked on the landlord's office. 3 slow knocks. My sister heard them through our call. At the same time, 3 knocks sounded at her front door. "Don't answer it," I whispered. The voice outside the office whispered with me. "Don't answer it," my sister screamed. The call ended. The police arrived 4 minutes later. The silhouette outside the office had disappeared. 2 officers searched the building. They found the door to 6B locked. The landlord arrived and opened it for them. Once again, the apartment was empty. But something had changed. The plastic sheets had been removed from the furniture. The kitchen cabinets were filled with food. Photographs had been arranged across the living room wall. Every photograph showed me. Some had been taken through the windows of my workplace. Some showed me asleep in apartment 7B. Others were older. One showed me at my high school graduation. Another showed me as a child, standing beside my mother at the beach. Those photographs had never been posted online. My mother kept them in albums at her house, 300 miles away. In the bedroom, the police found a bed with warm sheets. On the nightstand was a notebook. Every page was filled with my handwriting. The first pages described ordinary things I had done during the previous month. What I ate, what I wore, who I called. The later pages described things that had not happened yet. They said my sister would report me missing. They said my employer would receive an email announcing my resignation. They said I would return my apartment keys to the landlord on Friday morning. The final page contained only one sentence. "Once she leaves, go upstairs." The officers took the notebook and told me not to return to the building. I drove to my sister's house that night. She was safe. The woman outside had vanished before the police reached her street. For the next month, I slept on my sister's couch. I changed my number, closed my social media accounts, and resigned from my job in person so nobody could do it for me. The landlord mailed my belongings to a storage facility. He kept my security deposit. I did not argue. Mara contacted me again after she heard that I had moved. She told me the same thing had happened to her. At first, the voice beneath her apartment repeated what she said. Then it began saying things a moment before she said them. Eventually, it started going to work for her. Her co-workers claimed they had spoken to her on days when she had never left the building. That was why she ran. I asked what the thing wanted. Mara said she did not believe it wanted to kill us. Killing would leave an absence. It wanted to practice until there was no absence at all. 3 months passed. Then my sister came home from work and found me sitting at her kitchen table. At least, she thought it was me. The woman was wearing my clothes. She knew the security code. She knew where my sister kept the coffee and how much sugar I used. She even had the small scar beneath my chin. My sister spoke to her for almost 10 minutes before noticing one mistake. She asked about the night at the apartment. The woman smiled and said, "Which one?" My sister locked herself in the bathroom and called me. I was across town at a supermarket. By the time the police arrived, the kitchen was empty. On the table, they found the notebook from apartment 6B. The police had been keeping it in an evidence room. A new sentence had been added to the final page. She still needs more practice. I live alone again now. My new building has no apartment beneath mine. I chose a ground floor unit for that reason. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a woman speaking underneath the floorboards. She no longer repeats my words. She repeats my sister's. Last night, she laughed. It was my sister's laugh, perfectly copied. Then she said, "I think she finally trusts me." I called my sister immediately. She answered after the first ring. She told me everything was fine. Her voice sounded normal. Her breathing sounded normal. She remembered our private phrase. Before hanging up, she laughed and told me I worried too much. It was the same laugh I had just heard beneath my floor. I have called her 17 times since then. Every time she answers. Every time she says she is fine. And every time I ask to see her in person, she finds a reason to make me wait until tomorrow. Some dangers hide their faces. Others borrow the face you are most likely to trust. If tonight's stories stay with you, follow Night Evidence for more accounts from the hours when familiar things become impossible. And before you answer a voice in the dark, remember, recognition is not proof. Good night.